This is to be a nationally acclaimed film, we hope, at some point in time, of the Zachow Depot. It'll contain all the information I can think of relating to this depot, the purpose of which is to give the docents a file of information, or many files of information, that they can add into their tours of the depot. It's not expected that all this material will be used in any one tour, but it's a sort of a mind dump to give you a feel for the whole operation. The first thing you need to do as docent is get the depot set, as I said earlier, and we put a depot open sign with pink tape around it that's used clothespins to attach it to the other side of the sign to let people know that this is a tour day at the depot. Other preps will be coming up. There's two wooden crates that'll be inside the waiting room. We'll show you a picture of those momentarily. Those need to be set out on the freight cart. This sign puts the depot in context. The original was built in 1906, and we replicated this. We say 2011. It was not quite finished then, but most of it was. But it was one of 44 such depots in Northwestern built in 3 states. And I don't think there are any that exist anymore today. But W.C. Zachow found out about the railroad, that they were going to run an extension from Green Bay to Eland, Wisconsin. W.C. Zachow, being an entrepreneur, bought 84 acres in the middle of that stretch, and he wanted to move his freight business from village of Cecil to Zachow because there was a better point for him to ship his cattle and his farm equipment. And he sold 14 acres of the railroad, I'm sure at a very low price, for the right-of-way. But this puts the depot in context and where the name Zachow came from. It's a German name, basically, and W.C. himself is buried in Woodlawn Cemetery here in Shawano, and he was chairman of the Shawano National Bank at one time. But we're glad to have this sign here, which was done by B&J Sign Company, like all the signs in the park. But this is a picture of the original depot. The semaphore on this photo didn't have the arms on it. For the agent to deal with this, he would have had to climb this ladder up to these levers to make the signs move. Well, the signs aren't attached, and this whole apparatus disappeared. It's my historian type thinking that the sign was never activated in the first place. There just wasn't enough traffic, and Zachow and Bondwell and Pulaski were close enough to signal the change to any message they had to give to the agent and vice versa. The chimney on it has the yellow, the Cream City brick color. And we have that on the replica. We weren't able to get enough of that for the whole chimney, so we're using Brown County tan on the inside, which you'll see a little bit later. When I do tours and I'm acting as docent here, I always start my people on the outside. Many people just start out with the building first, and this sort of gets lost, all the outside review of things. So I start here, which puts the whole project into a historic context. It's a good place to start. Okay, as you know, this is a replica depot, but there are some original parts from the original depot from 1906. The standoffs you see on the depot, those things sticking out on the side and above the Zachow sign, actually came from Dale Dirks, who grew up in Zachow, and he's in Colorado, but there's a number of items that he steered us onto that are original, and I told him about the project, and he said, "Dean, I have the standoffs, I'll mail those to you," and he shipped those to me. So those are the actual standoffs and insulators for the telegraph system. The wire itself, as it turns out, came from Zachow also, because when the depots went out of business around the whole country, actually, at that time, many people stole everything that was loose. And we found about 800 feet of wire in a barn over in Zachow, and I think the people thought it was copper wire, but it wasn't copper wire, it was steel wire coated with copper. Impossible stuff to work with. The insulators on top of the telegraph pole, which was donated to us by Shawano Municipal Utilities, those insulators came from Zachow also. And there's a number of items inside the depot that were donated by the Dirks family. The insulators and the crossbar on the pole have an interesting background in that when the pole was given to us, the crossbars had steel pins in there. And of course they did not have steel pins in those crossbars in 1906 when the original depot was built. So we made the historically correct opinion and took the steel ones out, and we went to a lathe and made some wooden pins to hold the insulators, and that's what we have up there. And attaching the wires to the insulators, we actually had one of the SMU people climb up the pole with his spikes on his shoes to attach that wire and do the bending of the wire on the insulators. We had many historic pictures of the sign on the original depot, and they look like what you're seeing now on the film. The problem was we didn't know the construct of it, and I discovered in the Gillett Historical Society they had the Gillett sign in their basement. I went over and looked at it, and it looked identical to the Zachow sign except for the name. So we had somebody here in Shawano do the construction of the sign, and so it's identical to the original. My theory is that the person who did the Gillett sign was the same person that did the Zachow sign. The dot at the end of the W in Zachow, mystery on precisely what that is, but the best story for it is that when the telegraphers send a message, at the done with the message, they give one click, like a period, and we think that's what that dot represents on the Zachow sign. On the bottom of the depot on the corners, you'll see the black steel corner guards. Originally they were cast. It was a lot simpler just to cut it out of angle iron, which of course we did. A little bit of discussion with the architect and the builder whether the depot had these, but all the depots did to protect the building from the carts, which agents tend to run into the depot. The sign above the door is an original. The curiosity about it is that it's a porcelain sign. It was donated to us by Don Manlick's wife. Don had passed away, and his wife gave this to us. We had to do some repairs on it, but one of the local auto body shops took care of the little slight damage that the sign had. This Railway Express Agency sign is directly tied in with the American Express cart that we have out here that you'll see later, and then I'll make the connection between the two at that point. Below the Railway Express sign you'll see 4 milk cans, and then you'll see a message box, which is an original message box that we picked up from one of the people that borrowed railroad artifacts back in the day. And messages are passed between the trains and the depot using that. There was no electronic connection with the trains at this point. This would have been in the 1910s and 1920s like that. The milk cans below aren't for milk. Every depot was required to have 50 gallons of water available in case of fire, and the people who made up that rule were thinking of 50-gallon barrels. The depot agents weren't interested in that approach to it, so they went to the milk cans. We got about 10 gallons in each can out here. There's another can in the freight room that has makes it 50 gallons, so they were in compliance. This is our freight cart setup. If you look at the picture that's on the freight cart, you'll see a poultry box on the cart that's in the picture, and you'll notice that same box is on this cart. That needs to be lined up with the wheel on the left-hand side of the cart, as you're seeing on the video. The other crate on the cart is the Bratz Welding cart. Bratz Welding finished up the undercarriage of this replica freight cart. One interesting thing about it to talk about, it doesn't involve the setup of course, is the connection between American Express Company and Railway Express Agency, and I'll cover that later.
Okay.
This is the American Express Company freight cart sign. You'll see the photograph here. This actually gives you the history of the freight business with respect to the railroads in the country. There were many small freight companies that were servicing the freight for these depots, and when World War I came along, the government could not deal with it with their military needs. So many of these companies were forced to merge and consolidate, and the American Express Company only did this service for this Zachow Depot until 1918, and they got out of the business. So it was merged into other freight companies. Eventually the whole thing settled down to the REA Express company name, which was the name that American Express, the Railway Express Agency, signed over the depot, is related to that entity, and that was the entity that existed just before REA Express came in. But that business went out in 1975. They filed bankruptcy. But this short couple of paragraphs actually gives you the whole history of the railroad freight business in the United States. The cart itself was duplicated the same way we duplicated the freight cart itself. You'll notice on the picture, see close enough, this intersects this one agent's thigh about mid-thigh. Well, 4 or 5 of us measured our thighs from that position, and we averaged out at that number. We had another positive dimension of the cart over here on the bicycle tires, which were probably 27-inch tires. And we had 2 good measurements to go. So John Dornfeld, our head modeler, and myself did parallel guesstimates on what the size of the cart was. John and I were pretty close on the whole cart. Mine cart would have been 4 feet wider. John got the correct width of the cart, which is good. And we had construction drawings done by Larry Guller, who lives in Legend Lake. And so we were able to proceed putting the parts together to do this. On a closer inspection to the original picture, we realized that the small wheel assembly on each end was actually blacksmith work. And we were fortunate enough to find a blacksmith in Green Bay, Jeff Benson, who teaches architectural blacksmithing. And I showed him what our needs were, and we took the measurements, and he did that. And then the main wheel was the real tough one to get. We needed a 30-inch lightweight steel wheel, and we had a hard time finding that. We found some 30-inch heavy farm wheels that we have on our freight platform. But this came from eBay from Rochester, New York. I had a pile of rusty wheels there, and I bought those wheels and in the fall. And I told the gentleman I would pick them up in May when I come back to Shawano. And we blew the rust off, but we eventually ended up with the whole central apparatus over at Brass Welding here in Shawano. And they did the final assembly of the center wheel structures here. The blacksmith did also the end handles and so forth. The woodwork on here was done by Crossroads Cabinetry here in town, and they had a big bandsaw over there. They were able to cut the framework one solid piece without doing scarf joints, and also the deck boards. So the crew that put this together actually assembled what we ended up with was a cart kit, basically. But it took us 3 years and 18 different entities in the Shawano area to produce this reproduction cart. It didn't bother us at all that the cart is a reproduction, since the depot is a reproduction. And this was a very fun product. One high-tech thing that showed up in the process, the crate itself was a poultry crate, and we hunted around for a chicken when we found a high-tech chicken, and that we found one that grows fur instead of feathers. And I think that's a revolution. The freight platform that you're looking at was typical of what they had in the early days when a lot of material was coming into the Zachow Depot. We had a number of pictures of how they were set up. One of the pictures actually had a buggy on it, disassembled. You had to assemble it like a kit. What we have here are some 30-inch farm wheels. 2 sets of those. Those were required during our search for the 30-inch wheels for the freight cart. The white farm wagon you see was purchased from one of the Amish people in the area and reconditioned for us. He put in a new floor and whatnot, but that would have been typical of how freight was handled in the early days. Everything was done by horse and buggy, including the milk from the farmers to the local dairies on every corner. Cheese factories and whatnot. The plow also came from the Amish, and then the buggy wheels. The barrels were a little bit of a push, but that was typical of what was on the freight platform also. We didn't want to do any more because these things require some amount of maintenance. The shiny surfaces you see on all the metal is actually teak oil that covers up the rust, and I think it goes down to the base metal, and those have to be touched up about every 3 years, but dealing with teak oil is very easy. The aerial photograph that you're seeing at not a real good angle, but it's there. We put that up last year in the 2021 because it's the aerial photograph of Zachow that shows where the depot is, of course, but it's also representative of the diorama of Zachow that's in the freight room of the depot. And a lot of people don't know what Zachow is, where it is. This sort of puts the depot into context during its life in Zachow. So that was a nice addition this year. But we also put the same sign up on the Mountain Bay Trail in Zachow where the actual depot stood. And then it's a double-sided sign there, and at the other side we have a sign similar to the one that faces Franklin Street here talking about the depot, so that people in Zachow can see some of the origins of their small village. The wiring back here is the same as on the other side, of course. A little better view with the sun angle we're dealing with. We have a little better shot of the aerial photograph. This was taken back in the 40s, the large one. We found the original for it over in Bondwell Community Archives. It actually hung on the back wall in the bank that my dad ran in Zachow. But the depot that you're looking at is right here. I grew up right there, and the bank is right there. So I show people this to put, again, the whole project in the context of a village of 100 people. Depot right there. And that's the same place that the Mountain Bay Trail sign is. You may be interested in how we got the exact position of this, and that I was working with my navigation equipment from my sailing days to determine the latitude and longitude and whatnot and bearings off of buildings. But the problem was the plane isn't directly overhead, so it's not a flat surface. As I'm walking the property, I found a bunch of weeds on one end, and it was a rectangular pattern of weeds, and I looked at it, and it was old lumber and boards that were over this obvious hole in the ground. And what it turned out to be was the hole that was underneath the outhouse of the depot. So that made all my measurements. I didn't need any of those measurements. I just needed to know the distance of the outhouse from the depot, and I knew that from the exhibit you're looking at here in Shawano. So I measured the 51 feet from the outhouse to the depot. I added 20 for half the depot length. That made it 71 feet, and that's how far the sign is from that hole. And that would put it right smack in the middle of the depot. Maybe a little divine intervention there. This was a 1901 depot. We got the plan from the Chicago Northwestern Historical Society for it, but it's a pre-technological improvement depot. And then if you'll notice that the whole seat raises up for the men, and apparently that was a problem because everything below in that hole is exposed. But somebody decided to invent the trough system on the depots, which you saw later. So this is pre-trough outhouse. You'll notice that the seat is flipped up. There's a counterweight on there to make it tip up easily, but you know it was for one purpose, mainly men's number one issue. They didn't want to wet the seat, and so they would use that. And then some inventor came along and decided to make the whole system with a trough that leaked down into the same place. Of course, the way this is designed, that was one access plate for cleaning out the under the outhouse for maintenance. We laid 100 feet of track next to the depot with the idea that someday we might have a cattle car sitting here. That may never happen. They're just not in existence, and we would need a cattle car that would be about 36 to 40 feet long, not anything bigger. There are box cars that are that length that are rare. We haven't found one yet, but a cattle car could be built. Others talk about cabooses and engines and whatnot. Those are hobbies unto themselves. But somebody might come along one day and want to do that. This was laid by Hollabar Company in Green Bay, who puts in industrial rail sidings for corporations and businesses. And they sent a crew over here, and they laid a strip of track here, probably better than the Northwestern ever laid. The base of this track goes down about 4 or 5 feet of different layers of material. And this is mainline track. To keep track of the tie system of the railroads, they use what's called date nails, and there's a whole hobby out there of people collecting date nails. There's one on this end of our track here, it says 06 on it. Well, that's indicative of the year that the original depot was built. On the other end, we have one 06 and 12, and that would be indicative of the 12 would be indicative of when the depot was substantially finished. And the ballast would have been probably just cinders in the old days, but most of the railroads have ballast that looks pretty much like this. Of course, here we're showing the 2012 nail next to an 06 nail as well, but this was the year that the depot was substantially built. The diorama was not quite ready to go, and the depot was dedicated in 2013, a year after the 12 date. And of course we identify which railroad that this is representing.